Hi everyone. I'm a long way from home and I've never been to India before. So I want to start off just by saying a big thank you to the people from Kyoorius who have brought me all this way. It's just awesome to be here in Mumbai. I'm going to talk to you about two things today. First, I'm going to talk to you about the case for creativity, which is kind of my exploration into the link between creativity and effectiveness in advertising. And secondly, I'm going to tell you a story about a brand in New Zealand, one of the most down and out brands, and how creativity over the last few years has transformed that brand into one of the most successful and one of the most exciting brands in New Zealand and perhaps even the world. And I think you're going to like that story. But first, so the case for creativity, essentially what the case for creativity is a rounding up and sharing of all of the research into the link between creativity and effectiveness. And how I came to sort of be the guy to do this. When I started in advertising, it was the early 2000s, and as a young kind of planning person in the ad industry, I was really aware of this kind of argument between agencies and their clients around whether creativity had anything to do with business. On one side, we, at the agencies, we kind of wax lyrical about the power of creativity and try and do the most creative work we could. Over in the client world, often there was a skepticism about creativity, and they'd look into agencies and look at creative teams winning creative awards and trying to do more work that won more creative awards, and they would wonder whether it had much to do with them and the business of selling their product. And some of those views were pretty hard held. So this guy on the screen, in 2006 in Germany, McKinsey went around and they spoke to marketing directors of big companies and said, what does creativity mean to you? What's the role of creativity in advertising? And this person, who was a marketing director at a large FMCG company, he said creativity is irrelevant at best. Often it is downright harmful to advertising success. So this guy had a pretty unambiguous view that creativity was not something that was linked with effectiveness. And he wasn't the only one. There were people throughout our industry who, like him, felt really skeptical about creativity. And my observation was, we had this argument based on conjecture and based on anecdotal examples. So in the agency, we'd say, creativity is amazingly powerful, and here's some great campaigns that we can show you that have won awards and have also driven great business for their client. And the client would come back and say, well, that's not our experience, and here's some campaigns that we've seen that won lots of awards but didn't do anything for the client's business. And we'd go back and forth in this kind of circular argument, right? And for me, this is such a fundamental question in our industry, does creativity work? That it felt to me like it wasn't good enough just to kind of argue that point on conjecture and anecdotal examples, and that we should actually have some more scientific kind of data-driven way to answer this really fundamental question. And so I kind of set myself the task of going and rounding up all of the research around the world that had ever been done into creativity and effectiveness and do some research of my own and kind of pull that together and check out what that said and then share that with the world to see if we could answer that question once and for all. So I'm going to take you on a short tour through the highlights of that. I'm going to start with this McKinsey study. So after they talked to this marketing director, McKinsey went out and they did a big study where they looked at 100 different German marketing campaigns around the time. They separated them out into those that had won creative awards and those that had not. And they measured the effectiveness of those two groups. Now, when I say effectiveness, I mean sales, market share, profitability. I don't mean fluffy stuff like whether people like the brand or shared the campaign or any of that. I mean hard commercial stuff, and that's what McKinsey were looking at too. So they did their study in their very rigorous, boring McKinsey way, and they looked at things, and they came out with a really black and white answer. They concluded that absolutely there was night and day between the campaigns that were creatively awarded and the ones that weren't. The creatively awarded campaigns were much more effective. And they finished their report. The last line in their report said, other things being equal, creativity is an advertiser's best bet. So they were just as unambiguous as this marketing director had been, but in the opposite direction, and said, if you're a marketing person, you are much more likely to be effective if you pursue creative campaigns. A few years later, a friend of mine, Peter Field, he's a researcher in the UK, and he did a really similar study, but on a much bigger scale. So Peter used the IPA's data bank of 1,000 different effectiveness case studies from the UK and around the world. He did the same thing that McKinsey had done. He separated out the ones that had won creative awards and the ones that hadn't, and he compared the relative effectiveness of those two groups. Now, he looked at the market share increase that those two groups had shown for their client. And what he did a really interesting thing where he regressed everything back to a similar level of spend. So he took spend out of the picture. So, obviously campaigns that have a lot more spent on them will drive greater results. He regressed it all back to a similar line of spend, and he found that those campaigns that were creatively awarded were 11 times as efficient as the non-creatively awarded campaigns at driving that effectiveness result. 11 times, so that means you can either spend 11 times less and achieve the same result, or you can spend the same amount of money and achieve 11 times the result. So for any marketing person that is at all interested in return on investment and getting the biggest bang for their buck, they would be nuts not to pursue something that's more creative and more likely to be creatively awarded. Now, just a point on this. What I'm not saying, and what Peter's not saying, and what McKinsey isn't saying, is that you can just do crazy creative stuff and the results will follow in the absence of any strategy or any kind of thinking beyond that. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is that combined with a good, solid, insightful strategy, if you also have work with creative award-winning qualities, that combination is far more likely to get you a great result than just a good strategy with some average work. Then after Peter had done this study, I went and did a study of my own, and I was interested as an agency guy on whether the most awarded agencies, the most creatively awarded agencies, were also the most effectiveness awarded. Does a lot of creative awards in the reception of an ad agency mean that they deliver great results for their clients? So I did kind of a similar process to Peter and McKinsey. I went and got a whole lot of different agencies, and I separated them out into the ones that were the most creative. So they had been in the Gun Report top 50 most creatively awarded agencies more than twice over the last 5 years. And I compared them against the rest. And I found the same thing as McKinsey had found and Peter had found. When I added them up per $100 million of revenue, those creatively awarded agencies were over twice as effective at creating work that won effectiveness awards. And I repeated the study a couple of years ago and looked at the next bracket of 5 years, and again looked at the most successful Gun Report top 50 agencies versus the rest, and again found exactly the same thing, that those most creatively awarded agencies were more than twice as good at winning effectiveness awards for their clients. And so again, this kind of tells us that if we're a client looking for an agency, picking an agency that's really creatively awarded is actually a really smart thing to do. You are much more likely to end up with effectiveness awards if you choose an agency that's very creatively awarded. Third question I was interested in was, what about at a company level? If campaigns are more effective when they're more creative, if agencies are more effective when they're more creative, what about companies? Are they more successful when they're more creative? Who's been to Cannes Lions? Some of you? Okay, so Cannes Lions, if you don't know, is like the Oscars of advertising in the south of France every year. Everyone gets together and celebrates the best work in the world. And every year in Cannes, they award a special prize called Creative Marketer of the Year. And they give that prize to the company who has been the most prolific at creating lion-winning advertising, highly creative advertising over the past 2 or 3 years. And every year it's won by big global companies, like this year it's Burger King, and in the past it's been Heineken and Volkswagen and Nike and big companies like this. And a friend of mine, Jonathan Mildenhall, he's the chief marketing officer of Airbnb, but back at the time he was at Coca-Cola, and he said, I've been coming to Cannes every year for years and years, and every year I notice that the Creative Marketer of the Year company, when they win that prize, they're experiencing amazing stock market performance. And he said, I think there's a real correlation between creativity and award-winning ads and stock market performance. And to be honest with you, I thought that just sounds way too good to be true. I cannot buy that a few Cannes Lion-winning ads can possibly dictate the stock market performance of the world's largest companies. But let's go and have a look and dig through the data and see what it says. So I went and did the study, and I looked at every company since 1999 who had won Creative Marketer of the Year, and I looked at their stock market performance. And this was 2009, and so I started with Volkswagen, who was the winner that year. And as you can see from the chart, leading up to that win, their stock market performance was stratospheric. So that green line at the bottom is the S&P 500. That actually declined over that period as Volkswagen achieved enormous stock market results. So they certainly proved out the case. Then I went and looked at all the rest of them. There's Adidas. So Adidas back in 2006, really similar story. Pretty sluggish S&P 500, huge result for Adidas. If we look at Coca-Cola, from the beginning of their Open Happiness campaign, which was one of the most awarded campaigns ever, to them being awarded Creative Marketer of the Year, again, massively outperforming the S&P 500. And when you look at all of these companies, if you add up their performance on the stock market over that period compared to the S&P 500, over the last 15 years, the S&P 500 moved about 7.5%. Those Creative Marketer of the Year companies have moved 3.5 times that much. So if you were an investor and you'd put your money in Creative Marketer of the Year companies, you would be 3.5 times better off than if you'd invested in an index like the S&P 500. Now, I still, even after discovering this, I still couldn't quite figure out how the Cannes Lion winning ads drove the stock market performance. So I went and I talked to all of those companies, and I talked to the people who were leading them at the time. And I said, what was going on? Why was your stock market performance so good? And did advertising have anything to do with that? And they all said pretty much the same thing. They all said, well, yeah, we did some great advertising and our brand was really strong, and so that supported the company and what it did. But you know what? It wasn't just the advertising. Alongside the advertising, we were going through a really creative, innovative period right throughout the company. So our product development was more innovative. How we dealt with staff was more innovative. How we went to market and did our retailing, everything we did was more innovative. We were making bold, creative, innovative decisions everywhere. And buying more creative advertising was symptomatic of that. Because we were in this creative mindset as a company and we had this creative culture, when our marketing people went to the agency, they naturally bought more creative work because they were in that kind of mindset, right? I think that's really interesting, that creative advertising is something of a lead indicator for how creative and innovative the culture of a large organization is. And, today more than ever, in a world where innovation and disruption rule, it's those companies that do have those creative and innovative cultures who are the ones that are thriving, and the ones that don't are struggling and will continue to find it even harder. So I think there's something of if you're to invest in any company, I'd be investing in the ones that are doing the most creative advertising, because it shows that they have a culture of creativity that probably extends beyond the advertising and marketing. And speaking of a company that has a creative culture that extends beyond the marketing, I'm going to show you the story of a brand called DB Export. When I started working on this brand, I was running planning at Colenso BBDO in New Zealand. And we didn't have a beer account, and we really wanted a beer account. And so we were pestering DB breweries to give us their business. And they didn't want to give it to us, and we kept pestering them, and eventually they realized we weren't going away. And so they said, okay, you can have something to work on. You can have our worst brand, DB Export. This is the brand that no one wants to work on. And it's a brand that's been in decline for 10 years straight, year-on-year decline. We've done 6 different campaigns over that period. None of them has done anything to pull the brand out of decline. No one likes it, and we're probably going to just forget about it and, let it die. But we'll give it one more go. And if you want, you can have a go at helping us revive it. So we said, okay, we'll take that challenge on. And so the first thing that I did as the planner is I wanted to understand, the people that do like this brand, because we're still guys drinking the beer, the people that do like this brand, I want to find them and I want to understand what they love about it. And maybe we can build on that. So I went to a research recruitment company and I said, go and find me guys who love DB Export. I want to talk to them. And they came back a couple of weeks later and they said, James, we can't find any guys that love DB Export. We can find guys that drink it because it's on special and drink it because it's the only thing there, but we can't find anyone who loves it. And so, when we dug into that, the reason that no one loved it is this was a beer brand without any story. It didn't have any sense of kind of history or a credible sort of story behind it, which great beer brands all have. And what people thought was that it was a beer that was invented by the marketing department in the 1980s or 1990s to sort of capitalize on a trend. You know, it wasn't even a real brewer's beer. It was just kind of something that was a kind of marketing beer. So I was kind of grappling with, okay, how are we going to give this brand with no story? How are we going to give it a sense of story and a sense of credibility? And, you know, it was a pretty uphill battle. And while I was battling away, I went out to DB and I spoke to a guy called Doug Banks. Doug's the head brewer at DB. He still is, and at the time he had been there for 40 years, so he knew everything about the history of this company. Funnily enough, the marketing department never really spoke to him though, so they didn't know what he knew. And I said to him, Doug, I'm working on DB Export. They tell me it's a marketing beer that was invented in the 80s. It's got no story. And he said, what? That's not right. Come with me, young man, and I'll tell you about the story of DB Export. And he dragged me off to his office and he told me the most amazing story. He said, DB Export was created by a man called Morton Coutts. Morton Coutts was the founder of DB Breweries and came from a long line of beer brewing tradition. Morton's great-grandfather was a master brewer in one of the main brewing regions of Germany. His grandfather was one of the first people to bring brewing to New Zealand. His father opened the main trunk line brewery in Taihape in New Zealand in the late 1800s. And his father became incapacitated in an influenza epidemic in the 1920s and had to hand the brewery down to his son Morton, who was 15 at the time. So Morton Coutts, at 15 years old, took over the running of the main trunk line brewery in Taihape. And he turned out to be a beer brewing genius and a beer business genius. And he built that brewery up and he sold it on and he moved to Auckland and he built the Waitemata Brewery, which is the place where DB lived to this day. And he built that business up over the years until the 1950s, when the government introduced something called the Black Budget. Now, the Black Budget was a punitive tax regime where basically they taxed the importation of lots of different things to get more money into the government coffers. And one of the things they taxed was imported beer. Now, in New Zealand in the 1950s, we made good beer, but if you wanted to drink the best stuff, you drank the imported beer. And what this budget did was it put that imported beer out of the reach of the common, everyday New Zealand man, made it too expensive. And Morton thought this was a travesty. And he said, this is not right. Now, the common New Zealand man cannot afford to drink the best beer in the world. But he said, I've got a plan. If I can be the first New Zealander to brew the best beer in the world, then I'll make it here, the government won't tax it, and all the common men can continue drinking the best beer in the world for a fair price. So he set to work in the 1950s, brewing the best beer he'd ever brewed. He called it DB Export because he wanted it to hold its own anywhere in the world. And sure enough, in 1968, he was the first New Zealander to win Best Beer in the World in any class at the World Brewing Awards. He achieved his mission, and in doing so, he put the best beer in the world back in the hands of the New Zealand common man at a fair price. So Doug's telling me this story, and I'm completely blown away. Suddenly, in half an hour, this beer's gone from a beer with no story at all to the beer with the best story of any beer in the country. And nobody knew the story except for Doug and now me. And so I said to him, Doug, so this DB Export Gold beer that no one likes was the best beer in the world in 1968. And he said, well, no. Actually, over the years, we changed the beer, we fiddle with the recipe, and we react to legal changes and whatnot. And so DB Export Gold's nothing like the original DB Export beer. So I said, well, could you make the original one again? And he said, I think so. And he got out a big book, big recipe book, and dusted it down and looked at the recipe and said, yep, we can make that. That'd be quite nice, a bit like a modern craft beer. And I said, okay, well, could you make some? And he said, yep, give me 6 weeks. So I said, okay, you've got 6 weeks. And then 6 weeks later, he came back into the agency with the original DB Export beer, and we tried it, and it was great. And so we thought, we've got to go out and tell the story of this brand. It's a great story. But what if we could not only tell the story, but we could let people take a trip back in time and really experience this great beer? What if we got this beer and we put it in the bottle that it was originally in the 1960s with the original label that was on it in the 1960s, and we told the story around that, but we let people drink the history of this beer? Maybe that would be an even more powerful way to help people understand the history and the great story behind this beer. So I'm going to show you a video of how all that turned out.
We were asked to advertise Export Gold, a beer in steady decline for almost a decade. So we didn't. Instead, we released this beer. The problem facing this beer was that it had no history. It was seen as an out-of-date 80s marketing beer and the brand was slowly dying. Even in our agency, we noticed at the end of a big night, the only beer left in the fridge would be Export Gold. But as they say, good problems are hard to find, so we spoke to Dave. He told us the incredible story behind the very first DB Export brew, the grandfather of Export Gold, a story with heroes, villains, betrayal, rebellion, and the uprising of the common man. A story that had never been told.
Yeah, I guess no one really knew that Export, had a story. And when we looked into it, we found out that it had the best story of any New Zealand beer. It dates back 50 years to when the then Finance Minister, Arnold Nordmeyer, launched his infamous black budget. The effect of that was that the everyday working man could no longer afford a great beer after a hard day's work. And for Morton Coots, who was kind of the forefather of DB, this was intolerable. He used this as motivation to set out and create this export quality beer that would evade the clutches of Nordmeyer's budget. The beer launched in 1960, it was called DB Export Beer, and then 8 years later, Morton stunned the beer world by this beer becoming the first New Zealand beer ever to win Best Beer in the World.
We then spoke to Doug, the head brewer. We asked him, can we remake the original brew?
Yep.
Would it be any good?
Yep.
Our plan was simple. Re-release the infamous first brew exactly as it appeared in the 1950s and tell its story. And by doing so, give Export Gold a history and a connection with New Zealand that it had never had before. The day the vintage brew hit the shelves, we released a 5-minute short film about its creation and its humble creator Morton Coots. We also created cut-downs for TV. Everywhere we could have the conversation, we did. Everywhere, we connected Export Gold with the original export. We released interviews of people who knew Morton Coots personally and old-timers who were affected by the black budget and got major media attention, even invoking a response from Parliament and featuring at TED as one of the ads worth spreading. For the first time in almost a decade, Export Gold sales increased.
The month after the campaign's launch, Export Gold saw its highest market share in well over 18 months, which is a big turnaround for the brand.
Proof that every brand needs a good story.
As Dave sort of started to say there, the effect on the brand was enormous. In 6 months after that campaign ran, the DB Export was back at its market share level that it had been at in the late 90s when it was at the peak of its success. And so after 10 years of straight declines, by giving that beer its story back, we managed to completely revive its fortunes and get it back to where it was supposed to be. Then following on from that, we kind of thought, well, how do we, now that we've got this kind of base of a story and we've got this idea of this guy, Morton Coots, who was an innovator, he was a really creative guy who solved problems with beer. And so how can we continue to live the spirit of that? And the next beer that we got briefed on was a beer called Export Dry. So this is another variant in the Export family. Now, Export Dry, Morton had created Export Dry a little later. So he had created this in the 1980s. And we dug back through the history of why this beer was created and what was going on at the time. And in the 1980s in New Zealand, wine became fashionable. So people started drinking a lot more wine, specifically dry white wine. And so it was sort of viewed as a more sophisticated thing to drink, wine, than beer. And so people kind of shifted away a bit from beer and a bit towards wine. And so Morton thought, well, if I can brew a beer that is a more sophisticated beer and is a dry lager, then maybe that will enable beer-loving guys to move back from wine to beer. And we'd sort of asked people who were around in the 1980s, and they can remember sort of wine being trendy, but actually they would rather have been drinking beer. It was just a bit of a fashion thing. And so we kind of dug back into that history and positioned Export Dry as another of kind of Morton's solutions to guys being able to drink great beer.
It was 1987 and New Zealand was going off, but there was a problem. Wine was in and beer was out. While men pretended to enjoy wine, they never forgot about beer.
Hey, hon, want some wine?
Yes.
Awesome.
It's one.
Men needed a hero till the end of the night. And that hero was Morton Coots. He created Export Dry, a sophisticated beer, crisp and refreshing but still full of flavour. Men could finally say no to wine. 25 years later on, men can still say no.
Wineless, sir?
No.
Yes.
And the brand's continued to do that ever since. So the next thing we got briefed on was a beer called Export 33. Now this is a beer that Morton hadn't actually brewed himself. This happened long after he'd passed. But we thought, as became kind of the catch cry for the brand, what would Morton do? And 33 is a low-carb beer. So this is the kind of beer that you drink if you're a guy that likes beer, but you're putting on a bit of weight drinking all that beer. And you become less popular with the ladies when you do that. And so, again, 33 felt to us like a great solution to that problem. A beer that you could drink and stay on side with the women in your life. And so have a look at this. This is the next ad in the series for Export 33.
Women, stop being so beautiful for a moment and listen. How do you know your man loves you? He drinks Export 33, brewed to be full of delicious beer with less carbs. So every sip he takes for you. He gets a tastier beer.
Oh, yeah.
And you get a tastier man.
Oh, yeah.
When he has Export 33 in his hand, he has you in his heart.
Love. Emotion.
Commitment?
So women, the next time your man goes out, don't give him a hard time.
Hey! I got some beers!
Give him a smile.
See you later.
And whatever cash you have on you, because he's not going out to drink. He's going out to think about you.
As the kind of years went by, the brand sort of shifted away from telling stories about the variants and more onto a kind of platform of how this brand could go out and solve even bigger problems in the world. And, it was sort of decided that what would Morton do in this day and age? Well, he'd probably try and go and address things like global warming and really big problems in the world with beer. And what was one of the discoveries the agency made along the way to this campaign was that the process of brewing beer, one of the kind of outputs of that is ethanol, which can be made into a biofuel, which is better for the environment than standard petrol. And so the brand sort of took this extremely audacious view that if Morton was still alive, he'd go out and he'd do something like turn the output from beer brewing into a biofuel to save the world and enable guys to do something good for the planet while they drank their beer. And this is what came of that.
What would you do if I told you you could save the world by drinking beer? It sounds crazy, but it's true. Take a listen.
Brutrolium. It's a biofuel made from yeast and grain that's left over after they finish making beer.
Last week a new fuel source was revealed, which comes from the ethanol created during the beer brewing process.
From what we can see, it hasn't been done anywhere else in the world.
They are recruiting guys. They are actually recruiting guys to drink more beer for the planet. What a job.
Brutrolium.
Y lo han llamado Brutrolium.
Drink a beer and save the world. Well, yeah, that's every man's dream.
DB Breweries has created 300,000 litres of what they're calling Brutrolium.
Great moment for the nation, where a byproduct of one of our favourite things has been turned into fuel.
The supply Well, it relies entirely on you drinking beer.
People there can't seem to get enough of it. The brewery that came up with the idea is known as DB Export. It's selling its Brutrolium at 60 filling stations across New Zealand.
As New Zealand is the first in the world to power our cars by commercially available biofuel.
Sorry, babe, can't go to your sister's house. Me and the boys got to drink some beer. It's for the planet. That's all you need to know. Brutrolium is saving the planet.
Where are you going?
To save the world.
What time are you going to be back?
About 9. Text you if I'm going to be late.
What I love is how the brand's sort of managed to transform itself from, you know, the old stories of how it came to be and how Morton brought it into the world, and kind of take that legacy and that history and that spirit of creativity and innovation and really live up to that with the new things that the brand's getting up to. I'm going to finish on the latest campaign of DB Exports. This has just been released in New Zealand, and so you may not have seen it just yet, but this is following on from Brutrolium, another idea about how guys can drink beer and save the world in doing so. Have a look at DB Exports Sand.
Beaches are contending with what state officials say is critical sand erosion.
Dealing with illegally dredged sand.
Sand is disappearing.
A bit of a storm brewing over sand.
Beaches are at risk of vanishing.
The beaches are rapidly running out of sand.
Running out of sand.
Sand is not a sustainable resource.
Sand is used in everything from construction to pharmaceuticals, and as a result, 2/3 of the world's beaches are retreating. Desert sand is too round to be used in construction, sending the demand for beach sand soaring. The problem seems hard to believe, but the solution could be even more incredible. This machine from DB Export turns empty beer bottles into sand substitute. Amazingly, the answer to the sand shortage could be to drink beer. Each machine lets drinkers instantly crush their used bottles. A vacuum system removes silica dust and plastic labels, leaving behind pure glass sand.
So about 60,000 tonnes of glass goes to landfill every year. This project will keep the glass out of landfill.
Each bottle makes 200 grams of sand substitute. DB Export beer bottle sand is then distributed to construction companies and commercial partners, reducing the country's dependence on beach-derived sand.
Beach sand is a naturally occurring resource, has a finite limit to it. So beer bottle sand is something that we don't just want, we really need this to be used in our industry.
Kiwis, we love our beaches and we love our beer. So wouldn't it be great if you could have a beer and do something for the environment? I mean, that's pretty exciting.
To make a difference, to help protect their beaches, New Zealanders can now drink a beer.
That for me has been sort of the single most rewarding kind of case for creativity that I've had the pleasure of being involved with. An amazing story. I hope you found it inspiring. Thanks very much.